Hey, fellow Geonteers, those of us who like our spirituality with a twist. So we are doing an episode. We finished up a series on enlightenment. We're moving on. We want to do an episode that is really about something innovative and a little different slant, creative, that Daniel primarily wants to share, especially about what it means for human beings to have egos, specifically based on EGOS. That's the foreshadow. And Daniel shared it's a very thought-provoking idea. So anyways, that's our concept for the episode. And I think what you were talking about, Daniel, is you felt like it's kind of a word that gets tossed around a lot. And you had some thoughts on that. So
yeah, for sure. So, we hear it, right? The word gets used a lot. This person is egotistical, or this person is an egomaniac, or even in like spiritual circles, I think they'll talk about it like, you have to overcome the ego. You must kill the ego. You must transcend the ego, and it's one word that's used in different scenarios all the time, relatively ubiquitously. But I don't think the context of that, as much the language that we use, I don't think there's much context, and people just use stuff without, I think, going into the more like deeper meanings as to what it could represent, not just for oneself, but for people for people in general. Because it is sort of an archetype of our personality, actually. It's like saying depression, right? We know what that looks like and feels like, maybe within us or people who we're close to, or whatever. We can kind of feel that. But this is something that seems to be more psychologically based. And my contention here today is that it is, but it's so much more. So
we got kind of an interesting slant on it. So I guess part of what you're saying to me would be like, even if you talk about something like depression, that means different things to different people.
Yeah.
And even in our little Chinese medical world, which is, one of our home bases in doing this to share, like one person's depression in Chinese medicine is not another person's depression. There are different kinds of depression, and actually like a number of them, and they're not all the same. And they have to do with like maybe even different physiological mechanisms behind them, let alone like psychological. And then you take a word like ego. And I think that's one of the interesting things, like you were pointing out, is just that like people use that in many different ways. And so, depending on the area of life you're looking at, people will define that thing in different ways, right? Yeah.
And so we're kind of like, we're going to just give a basic definition for the ego. I'll give two of them, one in psychoanalysis and one in kind of philosophy, because, we're going to do our best job at being good University of Chicago students, the Maroons. Subsequently wearing a maroon shirt if you're watching on the video,
So back to our Mary Kay first episode, she was like, when I went back into undergrad, you had to define every single thing in the beginning, and you're like, yeah. Well,
that helps to frame the conversation. So in psychoanalysis, this is the part of the mind that, what they say anyways, or at least Oxford, says that it mediates between the conscious and unconscious and is responsible for reality testing and a sense of personal identity. So I think the parts that stick out for me there, Eric, is like the mediation between conscious and unconscious, and like that barrier between that. I think that fits moving forward with what I'll bring up in a minute. And reality testing is sort of ambiguous to me. Like I'm not quite sure what that reality testing, like, what is that? Is there a part of my mind that has like a test tube and a beaker, and it's like, all right, here we go, let's see what this happened, like
it's the little scientific part of you that comes out with a Geiger counter and whatever.
Exactly. I didn't.
Name tag says ego.
As the kids say, that one doesn't really hit right for me.
I'll like kind of give a take on it, like in my little feedback on that.
Sure.
I won't, I didn't want to like we talked about earlier, I didn't want to have the psychology run away with the episode, but I'll throw my 2 cents.
Yeah, sure. And then we'll just say, and then sense of personal identity. Yeah. Then that'll fit with moving forward. So that's kind of one part. And then the other,
I'll tell you what, why don't I throw my little psych thing in real quick before you get to the other part of it. Okay. So, like I said, I don't want to have I wanted to talk about just this a little bit. I was looking at we always shop talk ahead of time. We look at our show notes that we share with one another, and we kind of okay, what do we have to say about these things? And there's a lot that Daniel that you have to say, so I don't want to make a big thing about it, but I am giving a little preview for our relationship episode series that we're going to be heading into sometime quite soon. The clock is a ticking, and so that means we have to prep that shit. And And it's interesting because I think in those episodes we'll be talking about a few major psych people. So if you like some psych people, that's in the offing, a little preview. We'll talk about certainly Freud. We're going to talk about Jung, Carl Jung, the great Carl Jung. Another great figure that a lot of people might not know, this guy named Wilhelm Reich, who's a very interesting character, and a little bit about one of my favorite, Carl Rogers, who pops up here and there in our episodes. And the funny thing about that is they all have different things to say about relationships. So that's the preview, I think, to the relationship part. But they also have different things to say about what an ego is and what's in the conscious and the unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we'll go deeper into it. I think for Freud, he was mainly interested in the idea of like what people internalize that were either like societal values that are so deep you don't even recognize them, you know, and how that relates to more what you might call like animal instincts. So that was sort of his take, that the ego has to mitigate between these two things. On the one hand, we have these sort of biological drives and needs that are there. And then we're also socialized creatures. And that doesn't always fit. You know, the biological drives aren't always going to fit to like what the social vibe is going to be. That's just a complexity of living as a human being. You know what I mean? As our beloved Bobby T says, enlightenment is learning how to deal with complexity. So, and I have someone else beloved to me who like has been pointing it out lately. But in any case, you know, the idea is that, you know, that's where this reality testing thing sometimes pops up in the psych literature. Not that we want to spend all day on it, but that's where it pops up.
Okay.
You know, because there is this idea, part of the ego is going to, like the way Freud thought about it, it's part of what the ego is going to try to do is it's trying to figure out like, okay, there's this drive that are kind of biological, and then there's like sort of the social conditions. And the ego, the drives that are biological are more like immediate, you know, and they're probably like pleasure based.
Right. Well, yeah.
Big picture wise, some of that's sex, and we're going to do some sex episodes. Some of that's like, if someone really pisses you off, there's some animal party that wants to like go at them like a howler monkey.
Yeah.
You know, but you can't. So the reality testing part was sort of the like, okay, then you have all these internalized things that are like the ideas, the values, the proper behaviors in the culture where you're from, and the ego has to reality test that shit out to say, okay, what do I want to do? What's appropriate for me to do? How do I figure this out? That's the reality testing idea that he threw out there. And there's probably something to that, right?
Yeah, I think the inherent underlying part of that is that like the deeper ass part, and I guess he would probably say the id at that point, right?
Yeah, that's the id. That's the it.
Right.
Yeah, like in the German he had it, it's just like es. That's the word it, like these animal feelings that people have. Yeah,
that, right. Like that's a large. He gives that a larger drive.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, he's obsessed with it.
He's obsessed with that, and so then
Yeah.
the ego in this case is kind of like a Confucian. I don't know, a Confucian filter, making
it's a mediator or something.
Yeah, making it fit in reality.
I mean, he has this idea, this thing called the super ego, which I'm going to talk about some of the time. But, you know, just the idea, like you have a conscience, which is kind of like the super ego. So that's like your inner Confucian person going, wait a minute, don't go too out of balance. And that's not the way the youngest daughter should behave, or the middle son isn't, you know, like that kind of shit. That's Confucian stuff. Yeah. So, okay, that's that. Real quick, Carl Jung has this idea that there's this whole inner imaginative world inside. That's the collective unconscious idea for another day for us. That's interesting because there's different things potentially in the unconscious, and that has a lot of spiritual kick to it. From the medical side of us, that will be interesting. The unconscious kind of as the body itself too. How the body stores. I think some of the stuff that you're going to find interesting in your things for a different day. And then on the identity thing, we'll do a little bit about Carl Rogers and relationships. But he has this whole idea of like self-concept, which is kind of like an ego idea. But he thinks that it can go wrong a lot of the time, which I think is part of your idea too. That a lot of times this ego or self-concept thing just like goes wrong. And certainly that's a big deal in Buddhism and a lot of spirituality too. Anyway, so that's the kind of like, the 2-second riff and a preview of what we'll talk about. That's good. You know, just to throw some ingredients in the pot for what we're cooking.
Yeah, right? No, I think that's great. Yeah, that works well. Yeah. That's what I wanted. That's exactly what I wanted. So there, you know, and
it was ironic because I think we were joking. We haven't seen each other in I don't know how long, actually in the same space. But we like sometimes run parallel thought patterns and parallel lives as people who work on projects like ours do. And it's really funny because all the stuff you're bringing up here, I was like, oh, these are all the dudes I want to talk about, for the part of notes I'm going to write for the relationship stuff. So
Yeah,
synchronicity was synchronizing,
that's right.
as Carl Jung would say.
So that's the psychoanalytical part. The other part is the philosophical definition.
Yeah.
And they just gave this a quick few words. It says a conscious thinking subject, and which to me leaves so much almost more, on the plate, right? As a possibility that we won't dive too much into, but we'll touch this for a moment, right? So in order to have a subject, there must be an object, right? So what then is the object? So I'm going to assume that the external world is the object, which inherently gives credence to all of the sort of Buddhist ideas that things are subjective, right?
Yeah, it's funny. I was looking through, your thoughts on all of this, right? And I was like, okay, so at the end of the whole thing, because this will run away with an episode too, but it would be cool to talk about those Buddhist schools of thinking. And they're very experiential too. So sometimes it's called the Yogacara experiential school, where people have these insights of like, wait a minute, the difference between the subject and object, I'm partially making it up with my mind, at least partially, and maybe all of it. Right. I think I'm seeing a bunch of objects, but I might be really just seeing projections of my own mind in some way. Right. Yeah. It's also funny because of the parallelism, because I think when we do the relationship episodes, I also want to talk a little bit of like some existential psychology.
Sure.
And I was just doing research during the week, slightly prepping, and just of my own curiosity on like the great philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, and his long-term partner and other great philosopher Simone de Beauvoir, and they're interested in this thing called not only existentialism but phenomenology, where you kind of just look at like your own subjective experiences. And obviously we're doing a shit ton of phenomenology all the time. It's a fancy sounding word, but it really just means like looking at how people experience the world.
Yeah.
Which again is part of that subject object thing, and it probably kicks in the realization of like, wait a minute, a lot of what I think is the object is probably like the subject.
Right.
Yeah. So that's the question you're asking. So I think we'll be chipping away at that. I think in the Buddhist thing, maybe at the end after we kind of like talk through stuff, but I think this relationship will come up. Like this is going to be in our relationship episodes for sure. Yeah. So it's funny because a lot of this stuff I was like, damn, we're hitting, you're bringing up things that I know we're coming to my mind too. Like, okay, this is stuff we're definitely going to be talking about.
So this, so this idea then of like a subject and object, right, as like an internal experience that one is having versus their outside experience, and then the merging, I think, between the two in what way is kind of how I'm going to frame this idea of our egos and egos.
Hey Daniel, before we totally get into it, I wanted to throw one other person out for you that's slightly a preview, but I also thought you'd find her really interesting. So short thing, but I thought when I looked at like how you were thinking about this, I thought, oh, this is relevant for what Daniel's saying too. And she's also been on my mind in the past week. So cool, just to do it for a second.
Yeah.
So it's this Dr. Kim Tallbear. She's kind of this amazing intellectual figure. If you do a little search on YouTube, a bunch of videos, interviews will come up, and she's kind of a fascinating person. So she's a professor at the University of Alberta up in Canada. But her tribe people and roots are in the peoples of the Dakota Sioux. So she's, grew up directly within that Dakota Sioux culture and, had, like experience between the two cultures. She says a really funny thing. She says basically like she realized at a certain point her whole career was doing anthropology on white people. I thought that's so perfect, so true. And I had thought like, okay, me too. My whole life is also anthropology of white people, ironically enough, trying to figure them out. But so her work is really fascinating in terms of this idea of relationship. From the relationship side, it's going to be really interesting to look at in terms of the idea of like relationships beyond just normativity. She's a big proponent of looking at that. And she has this idea for preview of what will come up in future episodes, this idea of what she calls settler love or settler sexuality. Kind of this idea of, well, we'll save it. It's an interesting phrase though, and has a lot to do with like the way she sees how people have to live their relational lives as being part of sort of like authoritarian structures that were also the same kinds of structures that subjugated her people. So we'll look at it. It's an interesting thing to talk about. But the part that I thought that was really interesting for what you were talking about was her idea of relationality. And I couldn't help thinking about the shamanic part of your personality too, Daniel, when I was like thinking about this a little bit, because there was this whole thing about like, she kind of brings up this point that once this ego feeling gets so strong, it just naturally sort of psychologically starts to create this world of objects. You know, part of that world of objects is like having this sense of like a separate me, and it cuts, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And there's like this old Beatles song, like a George Harrison thing, I mean mine, I, me, mine. All of a sudden this starts, you know? And in the relational side, obviously that's something like, you know, we create ourselves, and then we create the objects of, you know, that are ours.
Mm-hmm.
My lover, my significant other, my kid, my this, my that, you know, like that part kicks in, which I think is so deep for the things that I know are close to your heart, in terms of that splitting. But the other part that I think is even like is much close to, you know, like both of our hearts too, is this idea of like, this includes splits with like the natural world that are so problematic in the culture, that there's this whole thing of like, once you go, I, me, mine, then all of a sudden the world becomes mine. This becomes my property, my land, my resources, my this, you know what I mean? And she's really big on this idea that this is like a kind of the root psychological and psychospiritual problem, even though she doesn't use that spiritual word. And the other part I thought you would find really interesting. So like, she worked a lot in environmentalism. And the whole idea is like, yeah, that's the problem from like a Dakota Sioux perspective. Eventually there was this idea of this I, me, mine ownership. And what she tries to say in the Dakota Sioux thing, and I'm wondering if you feel this way as a shaman too, this idea that even the language is problematic, because she says when you speak in the language of her people, it's all relational. You don't get this language. And so therefore you don't get as much of this cutting up of the world. And then you don't get that subject object split and this possessiveness.
Correct. Yeah.
You know, that's destructive that kicks in. So anyways, I wanted to throw it out to you because she's kind of fascinating. And ironically enough, I was just listening to her this week and I was like, wow, this is exactly what Daniel's talking about.
Yeah. The language is important, which is why we do this in you know, sort of a related thing. And then we're going to get back in Quechua, you know, which is a South American sort of native tongue. And that gets spoken by a number of different tribes, but in particularly the sort of like ayahuasca tradition that I'll, you know, tend to work with more than others, known as the Shipibo tribe. And they're probably one of the longest standing, kind of most well-known tribes that work with that medicine. They don't have descriptions for not good. They don't have descriptions for bad.
Oh yeah.
They just say like not good. That's the best they're gonna do. You know, not healthy. But they don't have, you know what I'm saying? Like they don't have words for like terrible or thing. It's not in their language. And one of my friends, Remy, who was on the podcast a while back, episode's called Kumankaya. He said that when he speaks in that language, it changes his mind. It almost makes him happier because the language that he's using is totally different. Same thing. There's another book by a guy named Martin Prechtel. It's called Secrets of the Talking Jaguar, where he kind of gives his life, and he's half Native American, half white. He goes to South America, really great writer. But one of the things he says is that there is no possessive terms. So it's not our land, it's land. It's not my house, it's home. You know what I'm saying? Like, so there's a definite difference here, but which is, you know, what we do, you know, when we speak on here, we're speaking intentionally for sure. Obviously we joke here and there and try to lighten it up a little bit, but the things that we're bringing are of language-based intentionality. Like we're using specific words, hopefully most of the time, to try and bring a point home, because language is relational, right? It fits inside of a container when talking about some energetic thing or some philosophical mind construct, and then it's sort of stuck in there like a cage. And then when it leaves off of that, then you have to almost like start a new thing. There's a quote I like. It says, well, I'm not gonna remember it, but something about it doesn't matter. We're moving on.
The funny thing was, like, talk about quotes. My mom, I think, got it for me somewhere, and it was like sort of a T-shirt, and I can't remember which figure it was. It was kind of one of the great sort of indigenous Native American figures, but she had it on a T-shirt, and it was just like about the impossibility within Native American culture, to like think that you owned land, just how crazy that was, you
Yeah.
know? And I wore it around for years. And I, you know, like it's the way that those words rub off on you, even if
Yeah.
it's sitting on your own chest, you
Yeah.
know?
Oh,
You're
I
like,
think
like, you know, it's like you look at it and you're like, yeah, it's crazy. You know, once you see that, it's just a bizarre idea. Why would you even have that idea?
yeah.
It's so crazy.
The quote is I think he says language is like throwing a net into the ineffable.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
That is very poetically
So
beautiful.
so based
Oh,
based on all of that.
okay, just one last thing about this. I wanted to just ask you in this shamanic thing, and you know, I don't want to, you know, again, but just because you talked about like there's no bad, do you think that's just because of an influence of
Well,
like
it's not a shaman. That's their language. That's
within
not,
the language, yeah, within the language,
yeah.
but like, well, I guess probably would connect to shamanic thought though, right? Because that's the belief system within the thought,
Well,
or
that's you know, what survives from a culture is, you know, their medicine, their artwork, their language, right? You know what I'm saying? So this is part of their medicine and how they, I mean, but it is part of their culture as well. Yes.
I'm
So,
like the subject object thing, just because we end up talking about dualism, right?
yeah.
And you know, dualism has so many meanings to it. But the thing that just hit me from what you're talking about is like, you know, we live and we're all brought up in this culture, which is like very dualistic in terms of like good, bad too. You know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
we got like in the culture the idea of like the ultimate bad,
Mhm.
you know, some little
Yeah.
sitting out there that's
That's
like
right.
not just bad, but like bad,
Right.
all capital
Yeah.
BAD.
Yeah.
And you know, like you sort of, I can remember like, you know, there's something like in Zen, you know, when I first started doing it, and then the Tibetan Buddhist world too. I remember talking to people about this, especially people who came from really strong you know, Western religious backgrounds. It was a lot to like give up that idea of like bad, you know, like it's in there. And so people feel a lot of guilt, they feel a lot of
Yeah.
shame, they
Yep.
feel a lot of this around this bad idea. I think it's something that I can imagine you and Mary Kay talking about, and maybe we talked about it in one of the Mary Kay
Mhm.
episodes in some ways already, you
Mhm.
know, perfectionism and having to be
Yep.
all perfect, and you know, otherwise you're bad, and this whole idea of like feeling bad, like and guilty, and maybe guilty for like who you are and what you want. I was talking to someone, you know, that I love a lot in the past week about this, and just this whole idea of like guilt, feeling bad for
Sure.
who like you really are. You know what I mean? Because you can feel bad down to the core or something. But I
Yeah.
think you have to have that concept of even like feeling bad. You have to have some dualism or something, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Which I
Yeah,
guess is
but
part of what you're trying to explain with this ego thing too, as you go through it.
yes, but no, because yes and no, because the other part is that like that, but there is a thing as ethics.
Yeah, that's right.
You know what I'm saying? So like, well, yes, they all dualism for sure exists, and it can make people feel bad for sure. But and then that is not mitigating of like behavior that is more apropos for compassionate existence. You know,
Yeah, but it changes different episodes in some ways, different
things.
episodes. But there is something interesting that just in the sense that like what's ethical or not ethical in different places
For
is
sure.
different. And so
Right.
there's that one feeling of like, well, let me like not harm people.
Right.
Let me not like just be an asshole
Yeah.
about things.
That.
That's different than like I'm going to feel bad for other reasons, where you start saying, well, is this really bad or not bad,
Right.
actually?
Correct.
You know, that's a weird question.
Correct.
That probably does relate to the whole idea of an ego, and it even gets back to some of the psych stuff. Because once you start internalizing values, you know, depends on what you've internalized.
Yeah. Well, we'll see.
Yeah.
Right?
So it's perfect, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I want to give a little bit better understanding of this apparatus, right? This sort of idea of, and so I'm going to refer to it as our egos, EGOS, and we all have some various facets of it, right? And what does EGOS stand for? Because it's an acronym, and you know, you'll see it in the title of the podcast, and I'll leave it in the description, right? EGOS. This is the existential guardian operating system. So it's kind of like a program that we have within us. And all right, so why do I feel the need for this delineation? And I could say that after reading about trauma from like a psychological and societal perspective, and then diving into some sort of more modern Chinese medical texts, I ran across some similarities in the discussion and response to kind of treatment of trauma, working with trauma, something like this. And mainly that it's not that the act itself, but how we respond and live with it thereafter. Now, I'm not minimizing the effects of various traumas that people have, and to say, well, it doesn't matter what happened, it's what you do with it afterwards. I'm not saying that. There are definitely,
Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and you
we're
know,
not, this is not some kind of
with
like
upper lip.
weird
Yeah.
Republican, thing, right? That's not real in life. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you put the books bootstrap things in the actual notes. I didn't mean to jump the
Oh, you're
line. I
good.
did.
Yeah, no, you're good.
I didn't even
It,
realize you said it. It just popped into my head too.
yeah, because it's such a like whack ass quote. You know what I mean? Like it's just such a tripe set of words. Anyways,
I'm really interested in where you're going to take that, because this is obviously we're talking a lot about trauma now in the culture in so many
yeah,
ways, which is good, right?
it's good.
This is being discussed, but you're talking about like nuances around it and stuff. So I'm curious to see where you're going with it.
Yeah. I want to say that like the effects of these experiences shape us in one way or another, good or bad, for better or worse. Hence this kind of hence the acronym, right? And it's my further assertion that like the idea of ego, or as I'm calling it, egos, is a response mechanism, actually, right? So it's a response mechanism to our experiences. Now, whether we want to call those experiences trauma or, phenomenology, experience, like however, whatever synonym.
Whatever we kind of internalize in the process of our growth and development.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This then system. So if we think about it like an air defense system, or some other kind of like, I don't know, laser alarm that Tom Cruise has to go through in Mission Impossible or something like this,
Yeah, lots and lots of little lasers facing everywhere.
Exactly.
And Catherine Zeta-Jones has to like sexually
Yes,
crawl her way through it.
She's getting to the
Sean Connery like drools as she's doing it or something.
Yeah,
Is that in that old movie?
Yeah, she's working through the ego of the museum,
Yeah.
But okay, so then, all right, so this is kind of like my assertion, right? That everybody has experiences, right? And that this is the response to it. However,
so wait a minute, really quick, Daniel.
Yeah.
Then it's the G part that's particularly important and part of this, right? It's guarding something. It's part of a defensive mechanism, psychological apparatus, and the coining of the phrase.
Yes.
It existentially protects the person.
Correct.
And it guards. And so it's kind of operating like in a wary way.
Yeah. And it's always running.
Yeah.
And it's a program. And, if we're going to talk about it, we're going to go back to our hardware versus software, right? Discussion.
Yeah.
Right?
I could definitely thought about your default mode network fascination with this too.
Yeah. So I want to say, okay, so, all right. So let's just, for argument's sake, say that this is a truism, right? For right now, or some version of it is true, right? Well, when does it start, right? We think, oh, well, you're talking about trauma, so it must be when you're in childhood. And actually, the answer is no. I mean, it does start in childhood because that's when you start. So it has to start at some point, right? That's the beginning of the clock. Yeah. But when does the clock actually start? It starts with the people who created you, and who created them, and who created them, and it goes back further. And why do I say this? Because there are so many, learned behaviors that we observe and just learn through osmosis, and then recreate as we go on. You know what I'm saying? And not just behaviors, but like ways of being. The way that we are growing up, if we grow up in a poor, a less wealthy area, or if our parents grew up in a less wealthy or even like war-torn country, immigration, all these various possibilities that we might be subject to, not necessarily in our own childhood, but in others. And, the books that I've read definitely talk about this, but I could say from my own perspective, my family came here. I wasn't born yet. My mom was about 12 or 13. But they have a different mindset around money and like keeping everything really tight and getting what you need because you got to supply for so many people.
Was that like part of like your Palestinian roots going back?
Yeah, exactly. And and I was talking to my mom about just like, money, finances, whatever. She's like, you're the son of an immigrant. I would expect you to be no different than how you are. And it just hit me. I was like, oh, well, yeah, we forget because we're in our own life and we're growing up and so on and so forth, that like those things influence us. There's no two ways around it. So to be aware of this, I think is kind of like the beginning place that we can kind of like start to become conscious of how we're acting and interacting in the world. And then you take this inherited thing, right? Inherited behaviors, inherited influences, and then you have your own individual karma and stuff like this for how you're going to be. Then you exist now you have all that, and then you're Eric. You're in the world, and you have your experiences, and for you, it was, kind of a violent household and sort of like, I'm not going to say a sketchy area, but like, not exactly.
You could say white trash, or maybe you
Okay.
can't. I
Okay.
can.
You can.
As we were joking before the episode, unfortunately, those are my people.
Yeah. Say love. So you have,
Unfortunately.
so you have all these various experiences. Now, look, everyone is going to have their own life history, but everyone has one. No one is without some effect on their person. I'm not saying everybody was traumatized. I'm not saying everybody was beaten up or bullied or whatever. That's not, because that's not true. It's not true. However, the level of influence that somebody has on them varies person to person, household to household, and even child to child. Even if what they're, how one parent treated an older child versus a younger child versus a middle child, and you know what I'm saying, what they went
through. It's the irony, because my brother and I were just talking about this yesterday, and he's a private person. I don't want to share his business.
Yeah.
But it was really true that we had different impacts from different people.
Yeah.
And even the 4 adults in the house, for both of us, we kind of realized like 3 out of the 4 were really nasty to us, but it wasn't the same 3. The person, one of the people who was, I never had any issue with my whole life, nasty to my brother, and the same reverse. There was one of the people who was really nasty, like could have killed me. If things had gone a different, I would have been dangerous. Some of the violent stuff like didn't negatively affect my brother almost at all. So anyways, it's interesting because there's a lot of parallelisms that just, we kind of sometimes find ourselves in these synchronicity modes when we're planning these things. And like I was just having this conversation.
Yeah.
But I was going to ask you something else, Daniel, before, because you're kind of talking about something kind of deep, which is, if you use medical fancy language, you would say etiology. Like, where do things come from, right?
Yeah.
Like, what's the cause of something?
Yes.
And so I was looking at this part of this conversation, and I was trying to think, okay, so what are we talking about here? So partially, when we talk about our ancestors, part of it occurred to me is that we could be talking about like the sociocultural things that the people before us built.
Yes.
And so we're living within that, for good or for bad, we're living within that framework. I got issues with parts of the sociocultural framework, and I think it's going to fit into this, but I think part of you were talking about that. That's true, right?
Yeah. Yep.
They live in a world that was created. And so in that sense, we're connecting with our ancestors.
Yep.
But then I couldn't help but also think about kind of the shamanic aspect of this too. And I wanted to kick that around a little bit because I think this is really fascinating. And it's part of how like maybe different spiritual traditions maybe talk a little bit different, because I think in talking with you and Mary Kay, as 2 of my shamanic, and actually one other person too, who I mentioned a little bit, like the shamans in my life, the beloved shamans in my life. There is this idea of almost like how the ancestors impact in a more subtle kind of psycho-spiritual way, that we carry the kind of remnant and history of our ancestors. And I don't know where this like totally was in the discussion for you, but I thought I wanted to throw it out because I think it's one of the things that is in the area of cause.
Yeah.
That I would, I thought would be good just to hear deeply what you think about that a little bit for people.
Yeah. So that, and that's why I brought it up.
So what do you think about it?
That's exactly why I brought it up. And
I hope not jump on your notes. I wasn't sure. I didn't see it that way, but
no, you're good. Part of it is that like there's a guy I like to listen to. He's kind of famous, not super famous, but his name is Sadhguru. He's like a yogi person. And
yeah. I've seen like I never watched really, but he pops up on YouTube all the time.
And he has this funny thing. He says, "Do you know your great 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 grandmother?" And the person always says no. He goes, "Oh, then why do you have her nose on your face?"
It's a good line.
Yeah, no, it is. It is a good line. And I think for me, this is part of like the whole movement to become, enlightened, whatever that means, is to become not only conscious of unconscious processes, but to look at all of the things that we have inherited, which end up being many psycho-emotional aspects to us that are just there as like standard operations that go on without checks, balances, or even, I don't know, much awareness. Things just sort of happen and come out. And so as we kind of like move forward in our lives, like the responsibility on the person to kind of like do this sort of reflection on themselves, number one, but then to do like healing in a sense, healing on themselves, not only heals at least, and this is the way that I think is probably going to be viewed when, and I'm noticing the words coming up a little bit more, like ancestral healing. I'm seeing this, like, as you do what you do to you, you're also doing it to the other beings that are connected to you, right? And I don't just mean like, oh, that's my brother and he lives in, not my literal brother, but what's up, brother? Like anybody who I meet, like your actual people who are connected to you, that there's work being done that happens outside of linear time. And then if you take that view, that like you can have an effect on numerous people around you, you know what I'm saying? And not just like people in your vicinity, but people who are related to you in one way or another.
Hey, so we had a little technical faux pas. We're back. We were right in the middle of talking about this whole idea of ancestry and maybe like a shamanic take on it, which I find really interesting because amongst my shamanic peeps, there's a slightly different attitude towards this, and it fascinates me. But anyways, I was going to bring up, just in the synchronicity of the whole episode, I, for reals, had a patient yesterday, longer term patient, one of the ones who I've done a lot of the sort of the Taoist, Buddhist, acupuncture, Chinese medical stuff with, who has kind of like a probably shamanic roots somewhere back in her thing too. And she did like an ancestral healing ceremony. And it was cool. It was a longer thing. They did a number of rituals. She described parts of it to me. But even when I looked at her Chinese medical diagnostics, I mean, it was better. I was like, yeah, this looks good. I'll take some credit for it. But nice. I was also
very good, Eric. Good work.
I was, but I was also like, because like, okay, this looks really good from these rituals, you know what I mean? And I was like, and we were talking, and she was kind of like, oh yeah, in a certain part, it was my part of the medicine got her a place to do things. Now she's doing things, and that's even accelerating, the whole thing. And I was like, yeah, and like it's making the medicine better. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like if you look at the whole circle. So it was like it's pretty amazing. Like I was like doing her, in Chinese medicine, we check the pulse at the wrist to kind of like read health of the body. Different organs are affected there. And I was like, this looks good. I love it. Looks great. Like, this is fantastic. And I think, from her point of view, there definitely were things that needed to be healed within her immediate family thing.
Correct.
But we were also talking about, and that was part of probably even our medical work had a lot to do with that. We were talking, and just in how you sort of intuitively feel things with people, I was like, no, this is going back deep, what you're trying to heal. We're talking about not people you would ever know in your lifetime. This is like historical deep things she's trying to tap back into. And maybe like parts that have to do with, like, again, like her lineage and what she finds of value in her lineage and things like that. So anyways, I was just interested in this whole thing because I think it's part of the episode, obviously, that you're bringing up here too, this idea that we're tapping into something ancestral that goes beyond just how our parents were.
Yeah. And I mean,
our grandparents or something. Yeah.
I mean, you think about it, how many generations of us are carried in the female ovum, I mean, how many generations are there? Was I inside of my great grandmother? I don't know exactly how far back it goes. And then so there's this like infinite like physical connection, and then there's the energetic connection that like we do inherit epigenetic changes, right? They've shown this time and time again throughout different studies. And so if we can inherit positive epigenetic changes, well, then most definitely we can inherit negative epigenetic changes. And given the amount of trauma that, I mean, in like societal trauma, right? Genocides and the killing, like this just was a lot more pillaging. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't happen today, but, say what you will about modern society, once in a while I stick up for it. There is a lot less mass suffering, than there was previously under like many different, under the feudal system or during the dark ages or, whatever the case is. And we have the ability to speak freely and so on and so forth. So we could start to like think for ourselves and then look back and kind of work on some of these things that are inherently part of us that are, like you talked about earlier, deep in our unconscious mind. And we could probably even say in our unconscious beings as the parts that sort of like innervate the body in the nervous system or in the DNA, however you want to look at it.
So like in the notes for this, I was kind of going like, Chinese medicine, we sometimes use this word Jing.
Yeah.
It's translated as essence.
Yeah.
Right. So we're doing a little traditional Chinese medicine stuff here. And part of what the essence is the Chinese reference to like the genetic code and DNA, right? When you talk about DNA, what's the TCM, traditional Chinese medicine equivalent? You say it's in the Jing, and that's your kind of your epigenetics thing, right? That these things are kind of carried on going forward. So some of it obviously is like what we can talk about in the Jing. I guess some of it can be that whole like breaking the chain, like breaking the cycle of abuse, There's no doubt I thought about that too. There probably was some cycle of abuse that's probably psychological, right? Within, my family lineage or something. Somebody got abused over here, somebody got abused over there, and someone back in like Russia or whatever in Europe abused somebody. And like, these were all like learned behaviors that like filter down, right? The familial culture, like that's a problem in the familial culture perhaps, and maybe we can cut it, and my kids don't get that experience, right? And then some of it is probably more like subtle energetic factors that like reach back through time, right? Like you were saying, transcends time and space or something, I think, before we get cut off, right? This transcended like somewhere back a long time ago, something energetically. The dog is moving in the background, hey, for the first time, and has dog ancestry. But like, like moving way back, there's going to be something where, that's certainly in the shamanic view is like rippling through.
Yes.
Right. So you're trying to cure things that will go back in time in a way, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And maybe forward. I mean, it's outside of
forward too. It's outside space and time.
Yeah, we're talking about outside of time. So there's all of this that comes into who we are as beings, right? And so,
can I say one more thing about that, because I just want to get your feedback on this. So for me, I have to say, we were talking with my patient, and I was like, I got like, if you look at me, like how I think about it, I got no interest in my ancestors whatsoever. Sure. I don't give a shit about them. You know what I mean? Not in like that could sound like I don't care. They can all rot in hell. No, I don't feel that way. It isn't something I had really thought about. And I thought about that's a kind of a weird thing, because I know like someone like you, we've talked about this for a long time, or like this patient or other people I know in my life, they feel like this thing of connecting back to ancestry. And I don't know entirely what that means. It certainly could be probably, like a blind spot in how I see things, if we want to look at it from a shamanic point of view. And I don't mind saying that. I might not see that part of things, and maybe I should look more deeply at that. But there's a little Buddhist part of me that's like kind of looks from the point of view of like, there's the line of the Jing and there's a line of the ancestry, but like when you get into like reincarnation stuff, you don't really know who the hell anybody is. Correct. Anywhere. So part of your karmic ancestry might have nothing to do with this genetic ancestry. You might be coming from a completely different part of the universe dropping in here. And it's just an interesting thing. And it's a little contrast I've noticed in myself with people who are more shamanic. I'm not saying anybody's right or wrong. Right. I've just thought about the idea, and I realized, no, I think about it more like, what's the ancestry of my own line of spirit, or my line of Shen, or my line of this, which might be different than the line of the Jing that I'm residing in. Not that all that stuff doesn't matter, but I have more of a sensitivity for that part, where I know other people have more of a sensitivity for maybe like what we might call the Jing part, the genetic part. So anyway, I don't know what you think about that.
No, I have a thought
about it.
So not to, I don't want to go down this road too much, because it's a bigger road. However, I can appreciate that point. I think what I have come to be more aware of and appreciate currently is that, like, I'm not so sure of the randomness of our incarnation, right? So even if that's true, even if what you're saying is true, I'm not so sure as the randomness
of how it connects to that particular Jing.
Right. And so if it's not random, I'm not saying that it's all fate or whatever, but let's just say that there's some middle ground where there's some attractiveness, right? That it's not, you're not just a pinball in a wheel and you just kind of come out wherever you come out. That then inherent in the DNA, inherent in the hardware that you are merging with, we'll use a shamanic term, that you are merging with in this existence, is the life of an opportunity to enlighten yourself, whatever, take all these practices, learn all these things. But then the unlocking of the latent work that's within the physicality of this vessel, it also kind of falls on responsibility of the user as they're using it.
I see. So what you're saying is like, okay, even if you landed within this Jing, okay, no matter who you are, clean up the Jing that you're in, clean up that ancestral line. Why not?
Why not?
You're there now.
You're there now. And
why not do it? If that is actually a point of, okay, I can vibe with that.
And to your point, it will help you.
Yeah, that's right.
It will help you. And the shamanic view of this is that like your ancestry is a great source of power for you. Now, you and I both practicing, you more so than me in a sense, for sure. Practicing Buddhist, like there's many people that are not Buddhist at all. That are not Tibetan. Probably far more people who are not Tibetan than are Tibetan who practice.
That's part of their trouble with the Chinese right off the bat.
Right.
Yes. So they have an immediate problem with that.
So there's this, right? But they don't have, but there's many non-Tibetan lamas, many. And yeah, they get some questions, like our friend Lama Glenn, our beloved teacher who was on before. We should have him on again.
Yeah, we have to do that.
But they ask him, what happened to you? And he's like, oh, my GPS signal was off. I was meant to land in Nepal, but I ended up in Canada. The mountains are so pretty, But it does have this thing, and so to kind of like this point, it's like it's an opportunity that should be taken. Because there is benefit for you and in beings who are literally related to you in a physical sense,
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the impetus.
I got, like, as the capper of this from my side, I got in listening to you and Mary Kay, I'm like, I got no argument with this. I've been like, you listen to, we do this podcast, we talk with people, we talk with one another, you listen. And we try to learn, right, from everybody we have on, from each other, right? And so I've obviously I thought about this, and I'm like, okay, this is maybe different than my kind of like gut level intuitive way that I think about this, but I'm certainly open to the shamanic idea of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I can't deny looking at my patient, like this did something great for her, and that's always impressive for me because I'm like a doctor, and percentage of my identity. If something works, I'm in. You give an herb, you give a treatment, you give it this, it works. I'm like, okay, that's the proof for me, right? This is proved. But part of why I only wanted to close on was the idea, like, if I look at it back, like phenomenologically in my own experience of this, and maybe this is a problem somehow, or maybe it's not. Talking to you and Mary Kay, like Mary Kay would move back to Ireland, like our beloved, shamanic guest and just general beloved person in our existences. She'll move back to connect back to her roots. She feels that,
right? Where
for whatever reason, if I just look at it subjectively, I don't feel it. You know what I mean? I don't know what that means. I'm not trying to say it means something one way or the other. Maybe it's a blind spot on my part. Maybe it's because I'm so drawn to this other part of the Buddhist way of thinking. Maybe it's because I don't want to connect with these ancestors. Maybe I had an issue. Whatever it is, that's okay. So I just wanted to share that phenomenological part because I think it's interesting. I've talked with people like you and Mary Kay where you feel it. I don't know what it means, but I'm open to to the exploration of what it means, and it's not nothing. But I wanted to share it just because there might be other people who feel like me.
Sure.
All right. Anyways, cool.
So we have that as like the background of our beings, right? And then we have our own individual lives as we move forward in our families, in our communities, and we're certainly learning as we live, but we're far more vulnerable in our youth. And we learn through the adults around us. We learn through our community. We learn through our friends, through our social interactions and things like this. And the sort of implementation on these relationships, or these relational situations, on how we behave and then how we respond to them, ultimately, is my assertion, become our egos, become our existential guardian operating system. And it's a means of navigation, it's a means of adaptation, and it's a means of protection. Now, I use those three on purpose, right? So adaptation is how you can socially thrive. Right.
Well, that's Freud's almost like reality tester.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah, that's kind of like, to pull back from the earlier part of the conversation. That's kind of that.
Adaptation can have a positive or negative connotation to it, right? So you can adapt positively and say that, like, you can learn that humor helps to soften someone else's mood, right? But then you might learn that humor too far insults somebody, and so you don't do right. So you don't
Sometimes I'm
go
dealing
that
that
way.
with my son now.
Right.
It's like you gotta learn the line
Yes.
to where it's funny or where you're gonna like step on somebody and they're gonna be pissed off at you. You
Yes.
gotta learn that line. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
And
there.
that's very personal too, because I know you've talked about the idea that you traveled around a lot when you
Yeah.
were a youngster and you had to
Yep.
learn how do I vibe? How do I get into new situations? Maybe this
Yep.
is a tool I can use, right?
And so this adaptation then allows you to be successful in these things. And then the last one is the protection. And I think this is what I think that people are
So you're
talking
saying,
about.
make sure I follow it. You're saying
Yeah.
learning, adaptation, and protection. Those are the three ones that you're doing?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Navigation, navigation, adaptation, and protection.
Okay.
And so
Okay.
one is just figuring what's, this is like my nervous system. I'm like going in what's going on around me. I'm just sort of like figuring things out,
That's the navigation piece. Okay.
Yeah. And then the adaptation is like, okay, A plus B equals C. Or C equals B plus A, whatever, right?
Well, adaptation would be like there's a problem. I better try to fix it.
Yeah, try to fix, and then
either in a healthy way or a pathological way, depending. Right.
But it's you're responding to your stimulus. And then the defense part is the other part. This is the part, and when I say defense, I don't necessarily mean, we'll use a nervous system term, fight or flight, right? It doesn't always necessarily mean shield. It could mean attack, actually, right? So in some ways, you may be a victim of abuse. Well, you may be, hiding and scared at some point, but then, later on, you're going to say, well, fuck, I'm tired of being scared. That ain't going to happen no more. And now you become the abuser in order to not be abused any longer.
It's kind of like a weird thing of people flitting between like fight and flight stuff, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes you're like this, and sometimes you're like, I'm gonna lash out. And both of those things might be pathological in the sense that they get extreme or something, right?
And so that's
from like problematic environments.
That is the more, and I think that is the part, but it's not so violent, right? Not in today's society. I mean, there's obviously tons and tons of violence.
What I'm getting to more convinced of, though, there's a lot of violence.
There's a lot of violence.
There's a lot of violence.
For sure, there's a lot of violence, and it doesn't. All of those people always weren't violated, but they're responding to the extra. I believe, because I think in the core we're good. I think we're all good, no matter who you are. And I've been reading some things that they're interviewing prisoners and things like this, and the accounts of their childhoods are horrific. Yeah, horrific. If you read them and they opened up, I'm sure there's more. You'd be like, oh well, no wonder you're this way. I mean, what the hell? Who did that? So like, it may not be ancestry like 10 generations ago, but it's definitely like your parents. And then you're like, oh, your parents were pieces of shit. And then you go, well, what happened with their grandparents? Oh my God, your grandparents are. You're like, yeah, no wonder. You know what I'm saying? It's no wonder, and it's this kind of thing. And so
that's like the learned behavior aspect of that too, as well as whatever that might do genetically. And so
that's exactly what I was saying. And so this kind of like the last part, the defensive portion, that's the part that we generally see as the egoic portion, right? As the one that's interacting with the world. So it is you, but it is the you, to your point earlier, it's the separate version of you, the subjective version of you that is responding to the object in a particular way. And you could be sort of navigating, you could be adapting, but more likely we're responding off of defenses. And when you're responding off of defenses, then the sharper aspects of our personality will sort of come to the surface and start to navigate through these various situations that we will have. And then you focus more on yourself. And then now the sort of like individual components of your character start to kind of like pop up more to the surface along with your defensive persona, so that you can feel whatever, empowered, safe, however you want to do it. You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
It kind of like, if I click it back to the psych stuff we did at the beginning, there's overlaps with like a few things. One is with like the two Carls, Carl Jung and Carl Rogers, two of my favorite Carls. Also my mom had a cousin Carl, very nice guy.
I have a friend named Carl.
Really good at like making models. He was an adult guy who could make these amazing, like, you go down in the basement in his house in St. Louis, lots of models that were very cool. Anyways, uh, um, so in Carl Jung, he talks about the idea, and we'll do deep dive on him at some point, but he does talk about this idea of the persona. That's, I think, part of what you're talking about there too.
Yeah.
You develop a persona, a way of functioning in the world.
Yes.
That's partially like, I think, fits around some of your ideas of navigation, and it fits on all three: navigation, adaptation, and like protection, right? All three of those things, right? Because it helps you. And like, one of the things that Jung says is like, sometimes the persona takes over too much for people.
Yes.
He would watch kind of clinically, and he would say, people might work in a certain profession, maybe they're a doctor or a lawyer or whatever it is, and they start carrying that back into their life everywhere. They develop such a sense of persona that it's like kind of on all the time even. And he thought that this was like a major problem. Like, to what you're saying, they couldn't turn off that existential guardian operating system just off, and it was constantly functioning. So they were always operating through this persona part of who they are, The other thing that hit me about it from like, and we'll do a deep dive on Carl Rogers even more too, because these are great people. But on the Carl Rogers side, he talks about this self-concept thing, and the idea that you develop a self-concept could be good, could be pathological, and so I think what you're getting to is the idea that like a lot of this existential guardian operating system thing is kind of like, can go pathological, right? Okay, but so self-concept can be pathological. That's a weird way to talk about it. And in Rogers, he usually emphasizes the idea clinically in psych cases. What you're really doing is you have a self-concept that's pathological.
Yeah.
Right. That's one of your main problems. The person is going to carry a pathological self-concept, or in the lingo you're using, a pathological existential guardian operating system. But you're kind of saying like the same thing. He's saying the self-concept tends to be pathological. It tends to be something wrong with it. It doesn't really vibe right for the full, complete human, right? Something's wrong. And I think in your existential guardian operating system, way you're framing it, the idea is that a lot of times is going to go wrong, unfortunately, right? It could be functional, but a lot of times it goes haywire. And the guardian system isn't operating. And the other thing he mentions really interesting, which I think you think, but maybe we haven't fully said it yet, would be it wants to protect itself. So it doesn't just want to protect the person. It's like, he makes the point, it's self-guarding, which we can talk about maybe when we do him a little deeper. But the self-concept, once it's there, it doesn't even just operate to protect the person somehow. It operates to protect itself. Like those crazy, like 2001, The Space Odyssey, the computer goes crazy and it's supposed to protect the ship, but it starts protecting itself. He kind of makes that point, which I think it's implicit in what you're saying. So I thought I would just throw it out there because it's one of the other things that popped up when I was kind of looking at
so that would say that like itself has sentience, right? Because it has a self-preservation aspect. I don't know that I necessarily, if that, in my mind, that means that it's a separate entity. And that is not something I believe, actually.
Well, it's like, I think what they would say is it's part of a psyche, and the psyche has multiple components. The same way like the default mode network is part of a glob.
Sure.
Something like that.
I think that
raises a weird question of what does it mean for something to have sentience when you have like multiple parts of a human being. But
right.
Anyways,
so my thought is that no, it's the same sentience. It's the same sentience, and that it's doing its job, and it's guarding itself because that's a defense mechanism. If you were to come and attack it, and you're trying to shoot missiles at my invisible shield. I'm going to try and bolster the shield because that's my source of
Captain. Defense. Put power to this. It's like every Star Trek episode.
Exactly.
Every sci-fi thing ever. Yeah.
And so So I think that it's doing its job because it's still guarding the person. You're attacking the defense system, but the defense system is the first and last line of defense. Right. And, we're not going to have time to go into it, but
do you see that way as like purely like a defense system thing then?
And that in that situation, yes, so I think that the ego, in the way that we're talking about it, in the way that it gets used in the normal lexicon of description, is the defense system. That's how I view it, right? When they talk about it in the media or in something, they'll say, "Oh, this is a egomaniac," or "This is this person who is driven to be focused on themselves and themselves only, always at the cost of somebody else," right? Maybe with their own life, maybe with their sense of with a sharp sense of humor or these kind of things. And then in the spiritual sense, it's like, you have to overcome the ego. You have to transcend the ego, meaning you have to you're going to have to essentially escape from your own prison in a sense, right? And so what I'm saying is that I think is what we're talking about in one sense, but I also want to highlight that this is your ability to adapt and your ability to be in a navigatory kind of experience with your reality as the subject, being steeped in the object and not having such a clear delineation of either or, that there is this sort of osmosis that occurs, right? You're moving back and forth, right? But that barrier, if you're not conscious of it, is not just like a semi-permeable membrane, but actually becomes quite spiky and quite rough. And so then the separation, the feeling of separation increases. And once that occurs, that spikiness then gains momentum, gains habituation. And we're all product of what we do yesterday and yesterday and yesterday. It becomes more who we are, and it grows strength like a muscle. And so when you go and you try and poke at it, well, what's it going to do? It's not going to go, oh, it's going to poke back because it has learned and been positively rewarded from internal validation and from the external, world, that this is the way that I should be. This is the way that I am. I can't be anybody else but me. Yeah, but who were you before you were now?
So the standard kind of because I come from the psych background, right? And you think about a clinician. So a couple of things pop up with that to me. If you think about something like a self-concept, even part of the point that's made, and I think you're alluding to this too, is this idea at some point that was probably functional.
Yeah.
It probably wasn't shitty from the beginning, even. Under certain circumstances, that thing probably worked, which is the reason why that kind of evolved, in that person, so that even when they talk about the self-concept, it would be the idea that was adaptive at some point. Yeah. Even in our little TCM field, there's a guy named Dr. Leon Hammer, who was a child psychiatrist and also a TCM person. And he kind of makes this point. At some point, those patterns in that person, whatever that patterning of themselves is, the way that they kind of function probably worked to some extent, right? Then at some point it won't work anymore. When you poke at someone, it is true, right, from a psyche kind of language point of view, that you're going to get defense mechanisms a lot. It's one of the main problems, and we know this clinically. You try to get someone to change, you get resistance mechanisms, right? And we all know them. It's when you poke at the person, and maybe you don't even mean to poke. Right. You're not trying to be pokey, but something goes funny for them, and then they pop back at you, or something weird happens. They start acting weird. Then there's a whole line of thought that says you probably hit something that's a defense mechanism, or in the lingo you're using, some part of the existential guardian operating system is going because it feels as an attack, right? However that got built up. But the thing is, I would say, and if we have different thoughts and feelings on this is totally fine. As we get to the end, it gets to the episode for today. It's been good. Yeah, which would just be the idea. I got no issue with multiple parts of a person. That doesn't bother me. Yeah. And you'll have to we'll kick it around more as we go.
Yeah, I don't have and I think it's I use this example all the time. So for people who hear it all the time, I apologize. But colors in the visible light. It's a rainbow. They're all there, but they're all light. You know what I'm saying? And so this is much of the same thing. All these things are occurring at once. But the point, I think for me, what I would say probably in opposition to what you were referencing, not yourself, but when things go bad, you were referencing earlier about good and bad. I don't think that this particular thing has gone bad. It's just it's overcompensated. It's over adapted. And now it's to the point where it's so fixed and kind of oddly growing that it doesn't necessarily fit, right?
Obviously, we don't mean bad evil.
Yeah.
We mean bad that's probably not healthy.
Not healthy.
That's the not good.
Yeah. That's
exactly. Not good.
Yeah. So
you didn't do anything wrong. And I know that's a sensitive thing when we talk about these things. Part of what I think you like to do is say, hey, let's not blame people about stuff. Exactly. Let's not try to frame them in a negative way. They've probably been framed negative in their lives enough. Let's not frame again. And I agree with you. So, I hear what you're saying. Not to say something is bad, but everyone, to be a clinician, and to try to think about changing human beings and human beings' behavior and helping people get better, there is this part, and we'll talk about more next week, I guess, right?
Yeah,
Where
for
sometimes
sure.
you have to go like, okay, this isn't functional for you anymore.
Yeah.
This piece isn't working. And I guess that's probably an ending point, right?
That's where we're going next time. That's exactly where we're going. It's to, you know, find out like what's happening, like what's happening. I think for me, there's three pieces. Identification and investigation. You know, find out, what are we protecting? What are we protecting it from? And then why are we protecting it? And then when you can go through this, then we can start to look and break things down and say, okay, you know, what is our model of behavior when this occurs, when that occurs, when that occurs? And you start to become even more conscious of the things that you were unaware of. It's empowering. And to me, like as I'm growing and we're having these conversations on a weekly basis, which I'm very grateful for. We're also grateful for our audience, you know, who give us feedback and show us love. Like we definitely appreciate it. I am feeling more as time goes on that like in the act of enlightenment is becoming aware of all of that. It is the transformation of what I believe myself to be, but then also the transformation of what I don't know myself to be at the same time. You know what I'm saying?
It's kind of like you're developing I would say a clinical spiritual philosophy and language, right?
Yeah.
That are capturing ideas that you're using for yourself and for the people that you work with, right? Something like that.
Yeah. As is going on, I'm just kind of like starting to see how this goes, and different people react in different ways. And sometimes it is the far more timid, you know, quiet, kind of introverted individual. And then other times it's the loud, young, very boisterous, you know, seemingly outgoing, you know, whatever. And there's a balance to be had with it all. But if we don't approach it, then we never will be able to diagnose and we won't be able to even have the conversation around it, because even talking about it, you'll be pinged. Oh, what are you saying? You know, like, who are you talking about?
Defense, right?
It's defensive. Yeah, for sure. And I think it's, you know, getting ready to do this men's retreat in you know, in a little, you know, in a couple months from now. Like I'm just starting to kind of, as I talk to people about it, I'm hearing it a little bit, and I'm, you know, seeing all the various aspects to it. And it's, you know, it's interesting. So I'm trying to put language on something that I am feeling, you know, and I'm also seeing, but it doesn't have, it's not a thing, you know, it's a construct in a sense.
How does like, I mean, like, you know, a big part of my professional life has been like working with people who are becoming healers in different ways, right? For all of us. And like maybe that's one of the deepest things about becoming a healer. I mean, I felt that way about myself. You know, how do I describe this for myself? How do I describe this to myself? What's a way that I think about it that I can make work for me? You know, also that feeds back, you know, like Carl Jung can say whatever he's saying, this person can say whatever he's saying, but I also have to have this in the language and in the way that I can use it, that like I see it, that makes sense to me. You know what I mean? That resonates with me. Anyways, okay, so we'll pick it up, right?
We will pick it up. Yeah, we'll continue. We're going to continue right from here when we get back in, and you know, it'll be. And this is not just for healers, right? This is for self investigation. That's the
I think anyone trying to change themselves, part of like what you have to figure out, like even like getting the language, getting the terms, getting the ideas is like healing. It's part of the healing process because now you're recognizing stuff, right?
Yep.
That's your I, your identification and investigation.
Yeah, and I like things in 3, so I might add inquiry in the beginning of that. You know, you have to the seed of curiosity has to be there. You have to know, you have to want to do it in the first place.
Yeah,
you know. So, anyways, well, Eric, as always,
cool. Thank you so much
for the good conversation. Thank you for watching us on, you know, whatever podcast platform you're using, Apple, Spotify, Podtail, I don't know, you know, whatever. If you're on the YouTube, you know, hello, like, comment, subscribe. If you're checking us out on the Apple, please go ahead and leave us a review. It helps the show out. You know, sharing is caring, as they say. So please feel free to share. This is a labor of love. Eric and I don't ask for donations. We don't do any of those things. All we ask is that, you know, you share with somebody that might feel benefit from it. We certainly benefit. And we love to hear from everybody. So if you want to hit us up on one of the platforms that you're on, or you can email us at jinandtantra@gmail.com. That's jinandtantra@gmail.com. For Eric, this is Daniel. We'll catch you in the next one. Peace.